we're talking dinosaurs, right? Dinosaurs. And we noticed that a little bit about the background. Dinosaurs existed, there's no question. You can't deny the fossils. But of course, the question is when. Dinosaurs have also pretty much become the poster child of evolution. It's a way to capture the imaginations, minds of children, but even adults are captivated by these fearfully great or terrible lizards. You spend a lot of money, right, watching them recreated by CGI and other Marvel movie-making techniques. But the Bible is clear that everything that exists in this physical universe, according to Exodus chapter 20, was created in the first 6 days. And that would include dinosaurs. And so Jesus said in Mark chapter 10 and also in Matthew 19 that He made them male and female from the beginning. Romans chapter 1 says that from the very beginning of the creation, things were being perceived. Well, there had to be somebody here to do the perceiving. And so people have been here since the earth was 6 days old, and so created right, in fact, probably the same day we the dinosaurs, and so we lived as people and dinosaurs lived as contemporaries, without question. So we were looking last week when we stopped, I believe, at this idea of does the Bible mention dinosaurs? And as I was going back through that this week, I stumbled upon looking through my Fortify Your Faith Study Bible. And on page 925 through 930, there's a whole special section on Behemoth and Leviathan. So here it is, right here. I wouldn't have to go anywhere else. And we're not going to go through all this material because a lot of this material deals with the fact that the book of Job, of course, is written what style? All of these books in this section, Job, Psalms, Proverbs. Yeah, it's Hebrew poetry. And so you get this idea from a lot of commentators, well, it's poetic, therefore, what? Yeah, it's not actual. It's myth, it's hyperbolic, whatever. And so the folks at Apologetic Express spent quite a bit of time discussing why Job is not committed to hyperbole, even though it's written poetic form. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at God's argument to Job, and you really get to those 3 chapters or so towards the end, Job has, unlike his friends, he's correct in his theology, but he's kind of accused God. Like, what's going on? I thought that was pretty good, and I think I deserve. Job's idea was I kind of deserve an answer, and God's answer was, well, no, you don't. And the way he answered that was asking him a series of questions to show that you really don't. You're not in a position to demand anything. You're really not in a position to understand the universe and how it works and how I operate in it. And what your job is, and this is for all of us, when we're undergoing suffering and trials, we've already talked about, is you just keep your focus on me. And you'll be okay. Because I'm in charge and I'm in control, and I'm the only one that understands the beginning from the end. Now all things interrelate. And so he asked a series of questions, and it's interesting, the point the writers make in this article is he starts with the inanimate realm, if you will, will, if you go to Job chapter 38 and read verses 1 through 38, God asks questions about, they've got a list here, he asks questions about the earth's foundation, ocean, springs of the sea, recesses of the deep, the expanse, light, darkness, snow, hail, light, wind, rain, constellations, all kinds of things having to do with the physical realm. Now the question the authors ask is, are those things real or are they not real? And if they weren't real, what would be the point in God asking these questions to Job? Follow me? He's making a point to Job. What do you understand about these things, Job? You tell me. You're so smart. You tell me. Well, if these things are not real, then God's argument to Job really doesn't make a lot of sense. And so then they point out that if you go to chapter 38, verse 39 through about 41, verse 34, God asks a series of questions about some animals in the animal kingdom. Again, we're not going to go through all this because it's not the point of this, but he talks about the lion, the raven, the mountain goat, the wild donkey, the ostrich, the horse, the hawk, the eagle. Question. Job, do you understand how these things operate? Do you understand how these animals function? How they do this and that? Do you understand that? Job has to say no. Well, again, what's the point if these weren't real animals? And Job couldn't see one and say, well, no, I don't really understand how the hawk does that, or whatever, or the ostrich. And so that's the point. And so you'll want to, when you get your copy, and I know some of you you'll probably order one when they come back in February, you want to read this whole section. It really helps you with your understanding of the point of Job. But again, these things are literal. They're not figurative. He dazzles Job, God does, with the wonders of the inanimate world and the animal world to say, hey, if you can't even answer these things, what are you doing questioning me? So, that gets us to what? Go to Job. Let's talk about these two particular. I got to get back. Let's talk about the behemoth. Those two dinosaur-like creatures. All right. Let's see. Okay. We're in chapter 4. So now we get down to about verse 15 after all those things. And so he's kind of bringing this to a crescendo, right? Look now at the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass. Well, literally or figuratively. Did this animal eat grass like an ox or not? I mean, no, it's kind of silly. See, now his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first or chief of the ways of God. That's the size, the immensity, the power of this animal. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of weeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he's not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. So there's a whole section here in this book on the anatomy of both of these animals. And so it's interesting, the focus, as he says, as these writers say, is on the sheer size and power of this animal. Because it's the size and the power of this animal that reflects the size, the power, the glory of its creator. And that's what he's trying to get Job to see. And of course, the problem you've got here, when you go to a lot of these Bibles that you buy off the shelf, editors have put footnotes in because they've accepted evolutionary chronology, that is, well, men and dinosaurs didn't live together, the dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. God, because they've accepted that chronology, and that's even done in Homer Haley's commentary. They refer to these animals as what? You usually see in your footnotes. Yeah, the behemoth is a hippopotamus, supposedly. And the Leviathan is a crocodile. So, as these writers say, it is true that elephants and hippopotami have sizable stomach muscles. Sometimes they're referred to as elephants. However, their stomach muscles do not even begin to compare with the belly muscles of Diplodocus or Amphicoelius, whose massive stomachs were larger than an entire elephant. Just their stomach. Seismosaurus, I like that name, Seismosaurus, which means earthquake reptile, was so named because it was large enough that it may actually have shaken the ground as it walked. Its underside alone would have intimidated humans by its enormity, causing them to feel helpless and fearful in the face of such muscular power. Well, is that the point God's trying to get across or not? It is. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. Well, God compares his tail to a cedar. Well, how big was a cedar in the Bible? It's big. It's a big tree. And we read about them a lot in the Scriptures. I like what they say here. When one examines the farcically tiny tails of the hippo, elephant, rhino, and mammoth, it is immediately evident that you cannot consider these animals in this discussion because their tail is comically small compared to their bodies. But even a casual consideration of the tails of the larger sauropod dinosaurs, Apatosaurus, Argentinosaurus, Supersaurus, or Seismosaurus, you can see a tail that would be large enough for them to use it to ward off what? What would they do with their tails, more than likely? Huh? Yeah, attackers, enemies, you could whack some. If you ever had my dog's tail, sport's tail, whack you, it can hurt. He's got a pretty powerful tail. Now, you take sport's tail and you multiply it into the size of a dinosaur tail, he could do some damage with that thing. And he doesn't even try. He's just wagging his tail, man. He's whacking the wall, pow, pow, pow. His bones are like beams or tubes, as the New American Standard says, of bronze. His ribs like bars or rods of iron. As they say, the creature's skeletal structure was clearly framed to possess exceptional stability and strength. A hippo weighs 3 to 4 tons, a rhinoceros 1 to 2 tons, an elephant 5 to 7 tons. Argentinosaurus weighed 80 to 100 tons. So how many elephants would it take to make up one of him? Well, you'd have to have a pretty big skeletal structure to hold all that up. It says an Apatosaurus femur alone was as tall as a 6-foot man, just his femur.
They showed a picture of him cleaning one of those off at an archaeological site the other day, and I guess the first time I'd seen it, I was amazed.
But how big they are.
Yeah.
And so God summarizes, of course, in verse 19, He is the first or chief of the ways of God. The writers here say the underlying Hebrew word translated first refers to size, mass, weight, bulk, force, or strength. God challenged Job with his inability to tame, subdue, or control this massive creature.
Look again at the phrase, only he who made him can bring near his sword. And of course the implication is that humans would have had a difficult time subduing this animal, certainly during that time. So, I like what they, and if you get a chance to look at this, they have a chart. They got a chart on Behemoth from Job 40, and they got a chart lined up, and it's got hippo, elephant, dinosaur, 3 columns. And then they got about 10 categories. Eats grass, herbivore, powerful stomach muscles, moves tail like a cedar, bones, ribs like iron, bronze, first chief of the ways of God, only creator can approach. Mountains yield food to him, lies under lotus trees, marsh, raging river does not disturb, unaffected by snare piercing. They got all these categories, and they check the boxes. And they check like 2 for the hippo and 2 or 3 for the elephant. Check every one of them for a dinosaur of that size. The others just don't fit the description. Then you've got a whole chapter, chapter 41, on Leviathan. Can you draw him out with a hook? You going to go fishing for him? Maybe you got your little cane pole and your and your float, bobbing up and down. Or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? It's obviously a very fierce animal. Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine, God says. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. I think if you go to Homer Haley's commentary, he talks about the crocodile laying in the water and the sun hits it just right during the day, and it looks like that's supposed to be sneezings of light. That's unnecessary. Out of his mouth go burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out, smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone. That word could be translated his chest is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. What's a millstone? What's the lower millstone? You've seen pictures. What was Samson doing? He was grinding. Usually they used animals. Samson was strong enough to push that thing by himself. You had this huge round stone, and then you had one on top of it with usually like a log or something out of it that they would tie the animal to, or somebody would have to push around to do what? Grind the grain. That stone that doesn't move, that's stationary, is the lower millstone. That's how hard, that's how he compares his chest plate. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid because of his crashings. They are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. When he's thrashing around in the mud, He makes the deep. Now look at the wake that he leaves. You ever been on a cruise and gone to the back of the boat? Watch the wake that those big ships leave. Or maybe you've seen one on TV, like from an aircraft carrier or something. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. On earth there is nothing like him, which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. Well, go back to Genesis chapter 1. And it says that God made the great what? I think the New King James says sea creatures. Right? The great sea creatures. Some translations render that, Young's Little Translation renders that great monsters, great sea monsters. But most say great sea creatures. But if you look at the outline, verses 1 through 10, it talks about Leviathan's invincibility. 10 and 11, God's preeminence. 12 through 24, Leviathan's anatomy. 25 through 32, his impact. And 33 through 34, his standing. And so God pummels Job with about 14 rhetorical questions to point out to him that you can't stop this animal. And you might as well not try. And notice his outer coat consists of rows of scales so tight that air cannot come between them. They are impenetrable. His teeth are terrible, fearsome, some translations say. So a lot of animals have sharp teeth, but this one's got some teeth on him. His sneezings flash forth light. Out of his mouth go burning light, sparks of fire. Smoke goes out of his nostrils. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Well, again, I just have to read you this. It's kind of humorous. In his commentary on Job, Homer Haley wrote this. Much of the crocodile's time was spent on the riverbank, basking in the sun. When he sneezed or yawned, the spray flashed his light. His eyes being like the eyelids of the morning may be a figure that suggests the Egyptians' use of the crocodile eyes and eyelids as heralds of the dawn because of their redness as they protruded above the water, the rest of the body being submerged beneath the surface. No doubt these impressions were drawn from the light reflected in the small bubbles from his mouth, which were viewed by the poet as burning torches and sparks of fire. So the writers of this article asked the question, so God sought to dazzle Job with Leviathan's ability to blow bubbles. Actually, a lot of aquatic creatures blow bubbles. That's not that impressive. And let me say this too before I get too far. The hippopotamus, the elephant, and the crocodile, even ancient men living during this time of Job, not just now, tamed these animals, captured these animals, killed these animals, ate these animals. You can see it in the Egyptians' writings about the crocodile, all that kind of thing. They weren't a problem. In fact, they took them as pets. That doesn't meet this description. Is there precedence in nature for the production of light and chemicals in animals? No question. And you see it. Bioluminescence, fluorescence, phosphorescence, triboluminescence, chemiluminescence entail the production and emission of light via chemical reactions. Name me something you've seen that produces light by a chemical reaction. A living, see them all the time around here. Lightning bugs, fireflies. But this phenomenon occurs all over the world and especially in the oceans, which, by the way, contains 99% of all life. Marine biologist and specialist Edith, she's a bioluminescent specialist, Edith Witter says some 80 to 90% of undersea creatures make light. and we know very little about how or why. Wait a minute, let me... She talks about a tube shoulder fish can eject bioluminescent cells when threatened. An electric eel can produce 500 volts of static electricity that can kill a grown human being. A bombardier beetle can fire a chemical bomb that explodes from its body at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So why is it so hard to believe that there's an animal that could sneeze fire out of his mouth? Right? Well, we could go on and on about it, but the point is that God's point to Job was, you look at these two creatures and you answer all these rhetorical questions I'm asking you. And when you do, you have a right to be in the same conversation with me, basically. And he didn't pick out a hippopotamus or a crocodile or an elephant to make those points. He picked out the biggest, strongest, fiercest creatures that have ever walked this earth. A couple of dinosaurs. And as I think about this too, and there's some other interesting articles you might want to check into, but I enjoy a good movie with a good dragon in it. I don't know about y'all, but I like dragons. But you know, dragon legends go back thousands of years. Well, what is a dragon? He's a reptile that shoots fire out of his mouth. Now, where do you think those legends came from? Now, I'm not saying they look just like the ones we put in movies, or that they could even fly. But certainly, there's a reason for all the dragon legends across various cultures. All right, well, let's move on to scientific evidence that men and dinosaurs coexistence. The Bible clearly teaches they coexisted. But is there evidence that they did? And I always enjoy this part of the discussion. And it's not quite as effective. I guess if I had some of the photos I could put on the screen, it'd be a little more effective. But you can look these up because they're fabulous to see. In the 1800s, Samuel Hubbard, honorary curator of archaeology at Oakland, California Museum of Natural History, was excavating ancient Indian dwellings in the Havasupai Canyon, Arizona. He was looking at various caves, walls of canyons where these Indians' ancestors had lived. And on the wall he found drawings of an elephant, an ibex, other animals, and a dinosaur. And I've seen this picture of this dinosaur. You probably have too. He looks kind of like one of those Tyrannosaurus Rex types. He's on his hind legs and his tail sticking out from behind him. And here's what he said. He said, taken all in all, the proportions are good. He said, it's depicted in the attitude in which a man would be most likely to see it, reared on its hind legs, balancing with his long tail, either feeding or in a fighting position, possibly defending itself against a party of men. He also said the fact that some prehistoric man made a pictograph of a dinosaur on the walls of the canyon upsets completely all of our theories regarding the antiquity of man. The fact that the animal is upright and balanced on its tail would seem to indicate that the prehistoric artist must have seen it alive. The point is, when we talk about some of these things we're going to talk about, like pictographs and burial stones, and things of that nature, when men who lived before, now when did we say the first dinosaur fossils were discovered in England? About what time frame? Yeah, like 1842 or something like that. So, if you find civilizations that just go back beyond 1840s, but some of these go back 2,000 to 3,000 years. If you find a civilization that could draw a dinosaur before we even knew there was such a thing or found any bones, what does that tell you? There's only two possibilities for them to draw a picture of a dinosaur. And what are they? Either the artist saw the dinosaur, or what? No, or somebody else saw it and told him. Somebody somewhere down the line in that civilization saw a dinosaur. And either they told the artist how to draw it, or it just got passed down far enough for him to draw it, but it doesn't matter. Somebody had to see it. Same thing. Yeah, just like the other animals drawn on the canyon wall. So, I always enjoy this one. Jules Rudd, you may have heard his name in some of these writings, German archaeologist from 1945, discovered these clay figurines buried at the foot of El Toro Mountain on the outskirts of Acambaro, Mexico. And eventually they found 32,000. They're just little clay figurines. And so they had them tested, radiometric tests performed in New Jersey. And they got dates of 1640 BC, 4530 BC, and 1110 BC. And then they took 18 samples that were further subjected to thermoluminescent testing at the University of Pennsylvania, and they all gave dates of 2500 BC. And that was all corresponding with the pottery they also found in the same area. But they later withdrew the testing results when they found out what? When they found some of the figurines were what? Dinosaurs. See? Some of the figurines that were made were dinosaurs. And when they found out that some of them were dinosaurs, they just threw all the tests out and said, well, that can't be right? Because we know dinosaurs died 65 million years ago. Well, how do we know that? Because we said they did. Let's see. In 1990, samples of various dinosaur bones were submitted for carbon-14 dating to the University of Arizona's Department of Geosciences Laboratory of Isotope Geochemistry. They had a couple different dinosaurs. They did a blind dating procedure. Dates assigned to the various fossils were 16 years, 120 years, and 23,000 years. Well, none of that's 65 million. Have you ever seen that picture of that Khmer temple, the Khmer civilization in Cambodia? I think some of you probably seen it. In fact, I saw it in a movie not long ago. It was in one of those, I can't remember what movie that was. Was it Tomb Raider? One of those, it was a Lara Croft Tomb Raider. It was in a movie. But this Cambodian temple from the Khmer civilization, about 1200 AD, I think is the date on it. If you look on that temple, it's got figures carved into the stone of various animals. You need to look this up. I've been there, and I've got pictures. Oh, you've seen it? And if you look, I think it's on the left side of the temple, as you're facing it on the door frame. There's an animal there, and it can't be anything but a Stegosaurus. Everybody know what a Stegosaurus looks like? It's one of the most favorite dinosaurs. You know, he's got those big spike things on his back. You know, that go all the way down his back. Okay. And that temple was built in 1200 AD. Now, how did those people know what a Stegosaurus looked like? Then you got the Inca burial stones. In 1966, a professor of medicine at the University of Lima, Peru, received an unusual rock by a local farmer for his birthday, and on the rock was a picture of a fish. And when he looked at it a little more closely, he just realized that the fish that was carved on the rock had been extinct, supposedly for thousands of years. And so they turned out to be ancient burial stones of the Inca Indians that they would place with their dead. And so he went looking and located over 11,000 of these rocks. Almost 1/3 of them depicted specific types of dinosaurs. So again, we ask the question, how did they know? How did these people know? How did the Inca Indians know what a dinosaur looks like? And that's not to mention or not to forget, too, that they've done some testing on some dinosaur fossils that they have discovered, and they have found what inside them? Living tissue. Marrow, blood vessels. That's impossible if something died 65 million years ago. So, of course, the question becomes, what happened to them? And we don't know for sure. The most popular theory, of course, is what, if you're an evolutionist? What happened to the dinosaurs? Everybody knows this. Yeah, some big meteor hit, caused a dust cloud that circled the earth and wiped them all out. Well, certainly a change in weather conditions affected them. I mean, they're reptiles. The antediluvian world was a much different place than the one we live in. Probably a warm tropical climate from pole to pole. And after the flood, things changed dramatically, and they changed quickly. Of course, a lot of them would have been killed. Those that you find, the fossils, they were buried in the flood. But the Bible says that Noah took every type of animal, every kind. That's not a species, it's a much broader taxification. But he took every kind of animal on the ark. So that would tell me that he probably took some dinosaurs on the ark. And, these are simple questions, and you can read about this more specifically. There's all kinds of writings out there on the specifics of the ark and the flood and all that. But, you ask, well, how'd you get a big dinosaur on the ark? Well, you don't take big dinosaurs on the ark. What do you take on the ark? You take babies on the ark. That's right. You take baby dinosaurs. But at any rate, even if he took dinosaurs on the ark, obviously once they got off, they had to adapt to whatever the change in the weather conditions were. And frankly, they had to have survived long enough. They had to survive long enough for us to have these things we've been talking about, right? If none of these burial stones, these pictographs, the Cambodian temple, none of these things would have survived a flood several thousand years ago. Those things all had to be done after the flood. Dragon legends, flood legends. Those things all arose after the flood. So the dinosaurs had to, they had to survive long enough for that kind of thing. But you know what? There have been thousands of species of animals come and go on this earth that have gone extinct. And not due to man, by the way. That's just the way the world works. And just like a lot of them have become extinct, that's just the way it is. Well, it's the conditions under which we live. But the Bible's clear, the earth was made for a particular purpose. And it will stand as long as it's serving that purpose. God's purpose. And God's purpose is about shaping us. It's about a probationary period. And we're going to talk, and that gets us into our next subject, where we're going to talk about the philosophy behind environmentalism and the deification of nature, and why that's so silly. Because that's not God's purpose, is not to save Mother Earth. In fact, God's purpose is to burn up the earth eventually and everything in it. So, the dinosaurs, you know, they're like a lot of things. They outlive their time. And so, but they were here, and they were here at the same time we're here. I've been here. Any questions or comments? Anybody know what year the first Earth Day was? Marks the birth of the modern environmental movement. 1970. In 1970, Kent State shootings, you remember that? Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel. Apollo 13, the Beatles broke up. The year Brother TJ came to the Memphis School of Preaching. April 22nd, first Earth Day. By July, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed. Various pieces of federal legislation designed to protect the environment quickly followed, including the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And ever since then, our lives have been changed dramatically. And don't get me wrong, I'm not for wastefulness. And as one college professor, I think, said one time, I'm not an environmentalist, but I'm a conservationist. That's two different things. So we'll talk about that next week. Yeah.